Greetings, I'm Willy Wonka, and welcome to episode 2 of me reading you Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. Yeah, now if you didn't watch episode 1, you should probably do that first, so you're caught up to speed. Yeah. And now before we get into today's portion of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, my dear children, make sure you're subscribed. Yeah, it's that little button right down there. Okay? Now we're on chapter 6, my dear children, which is titled The First Two Finders. Here we go. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop. Ew! And Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy, who was so enormously fat he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough, with two small greedy curranty eyes peering out upon the world. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. You're welcome, Augustus. You're a hero now because of me. Flags flying from all the windows, children had been given holiday from school, and a parade was being organized in honor of the famous youth. I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket, his mother had told the newspaperman. He ate so many candy bars a day that it was almost impossible for him to not find one. Eating is a hobby, you know. That's all he's interested in. But still, that's better than being a bulligan and shooting off zip guns and things like that in his spare time, isn't it? And what I always say is, he wouldn't go on eating like he does unless he needed nourishment, would he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill it will be for him to visit Mr. Wonka's marvelous factory. We're just as proud as we can be. What a revolting woman, said Grandma Josephine. And what a repulsive boy, said Grandma Georgina. Only 4 golden tickets left, said Grandpa George. I wonder who will get those. And now the whole country, indeed, the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad candy-buying spree. Everybody searching frantically for those precious remaining tickets. Fully grown women were seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka candy bars at a time, then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of the golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of $5,000 and spent the whole lot in candy bars that same afternoon. Thank you, gangster. I do appreciate it very much, yeah. And when the police entered his house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of candy, ripping off the wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. In far-off Russia, a woman called Charlotte Roos claimed to have found the second ticket, but it turned out to be a clever fake. In England, the famous scientist Professor Foulbody invented a machine in which would tell you at once, without opening a wrapper of a candy bar, whether or not there was a golden ticket hidden underneath it. The machine was a mechanical arm that shot out with tremendous force and grabbed hold of anything that had the slightest bit of gold inside of it. And for a moment, it looked like that was the answer to everything. But unfortunately, while the professor was showing off the machine to the public at the candy counter of a large department store, the mechanical arm shot out and made a grab for the gold filling in the back tooth of a duchess who was standing nearby. There was an ugly scene, and the machine was smashed by the crowd. Oh my goodness. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt. I always thought a verruca was a type of a wart you got on the bottom of your foot. Who lived with her parents in a great city far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture of the finder. She was sitting in a room of her house, waving the golden ticket far above her head and grinning from ear to ear. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspapers exactly how the ticket was found. You see, fellers, he said, as soon as my little girl told me she simply had to have one of those golden tickets, I went out into the town and started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them I must have bought. Hundreds of thousands. Wow. That's very impressive. Then I had them loaded into trucks and sent directly to my own factory. I'm in the peanut business, you see, and I've got 100 women working for me over at my joint, shelling peanuts and roasting and salting. That's what they do all day long, these women. They sit there shelling peanuts. And so I says to them, okay, girls, from now on you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers off these crazy candy bars instead. And they did. And I had every worker in the place yanking the paper off those bars of chocolate full speed ahead from morning till night. But 3 days went by, and we had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day, and every time I went home she would scream at me, "Where's my golden ticket?" I want my golden ticket. And she would lie there for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling in the most disturbing way. Veruca is so spoiled, I hate her, yeah. Well, sir, I just hated to see my little girl feeling unhappy like that, so I vowed I would keep the search up until I got her what she wanted. And then suddenly, on the evening of the 4th day, one of my women workers yelled, "I've got it, a golden ticket." And I said, "Give it to me quick," and she did. And I rushed it home and gave it to my darling Veruca. And now she's all smiles, and we have a happy home once again. They did Veruca really bad. She looks really ugly in that photo. Huh? Yeah. That's even worse than the fat boy, said Grandma Josephine. She needs a real good spanking, said Grandma Georgina. I don't think the girl's father played it quite fair, Grandpa, do you? Charlie muttered. He spoils her, Grandpa Joe said, and no good can ever come from spoiling a child like that. Charlie, you marked my words. Come to bed, my darling, said Charlie's mother. Tomorrow's your birthday. Don't forget that. So I expect you'll be up early to open your present. A Wonka candy bar, cried Charlie. It is a Wonka candy bar, isn't it? Yes, my love, his mother said. Of course it is. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I found the 3rd golden ticket inside of it, Charlie said. Bring it in here when you get it, Grandpa Joe said. Then we can all watch you taking off the wrapper. Welcome to Chapter 7, my dear children. It's titled Charlie's Birthday. Yeah, here we go. Happy birthday, cried the 4 grandparents as Charlie came into their room early the next morning. Charlie smiled nervously and sat down at the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his 2 hands. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight, it said on the wrapper. The 4 old people, 2 at either end of the bed, propped themselves up on their pillows and stared with anxious eyes at the candy bar in Charlie's hands. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the foot of the bed, watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Charlie looked down at the candy bar. He ran his fingers slowly back and forth along the length of it, stroking it lovingly, and the shiny paper wrapper made little sharp crackling noises in the quiet room. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling, if you don't find what you're looking for underneath that wrapper. You can't really expect to be as lucky as all that. She's quite right, Mr. Bucket said. Charlie didn't say anything. After all, Grandma Josephine said, in the whole wide world there are only 3 tickets left to be found. The thing to remember, Grandma Georgina said, is that whatever happens you'll still have the bar of candy. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight, cried Grandpa George. It's the best of them all. You'll just love it. Yes, Charlie whispered. I know. Just forget about all those golden tickets and enjoy the candy, Grandpa Joe said. Why don't you do that? They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little candy bar to have the magic ticket inside of it, and they were trying as greatly and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But there was one other thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this, that however small the chance might be of striking lucky, the chance was there. The chance had to be there. This particular candy bar had as much chance as any other of having the golden ticket. And that was why all the grandparents and parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. You better go ahead and open it up, or you'll be late for school, Grandpa Joe said. You might as well get it over with, Grandpa George said. Open it, my dear, Grandma Georgina said. Please open it. You're making me jumpy. Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, craning their scraggly necks. Then suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie tore the wrapper right down the middle, and onto his lap there fell a light brown creamy-colored chocolate candy bar. There was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. Well, that's that, said Grandpa Joe brightly. It's what we expected. Charlie looked up. 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, a small sad smile, and then shrugged his shoulders and picked up the candy bar and held it out to his mother, and said, Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it. Certainly not, his mother said. All the others cried, No, no. We wouldn't dream of taking it. It's all yours. Please, begged Charlie, turning around and offering it to Grandpa Joe, but neither he nor anyone else could even take a tiny bite. It's time to go to school, my darling, Mrs. Bucket said, putting an arm around Charlie's skinny shoulders. Come on, or you'll be late. That must have been very disappointing, Charlie. I'm very sorry you had to go through that. Yeah. And this is the start of Chapter 8, my dear children. 2 more golden tickets found. Oh, how exciting. Yeah. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th ticket as well. 2 golden tickets found today. screamed the headlines. Only one more left. All right, said Grandpa Joe, when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. Let's hear who found them. The third ticket, read Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. The third ticket was found by Miss Violet Beauregard. There was a great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking, and flashbulbs were flashing, and people were pushing and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. And the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly at an arm's length, as though she was flagging a taxi. And she was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that she said, because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. Chewing gum is really gross. Chewing gum I hate the most. Huh? I'm a gum chewer, normally, she shouted, but when I heard about these ticket things of Mr. Wonka's, I laid off the gum and switched to candy bars in hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm right back on gum. I just adore gum. Ew. I can't do without it. I munch on it all day long, except for a few minutes at mealtimes, when I take it out and stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the honest truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have that little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not ladylike, and it looks really ugly to see a girl's jaws going up and down like that all the time, but I don't agree. And who's she to criticize anyway? Because if you ask me, I'd say that her jaws are going up and down almost as much as mine, from yelling at me every minute of the day. Now, Violet, Miss Beauregard said from the far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. All right, Mother, keep your hair on, Miss Beauregard shouted. And now, she went on, turning to the reporters again, it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I'm chewing right at this moment is one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. That's a record, that is. That's beating the record held by my best friend, Miss Cornelia Presemetal, and she was mad. It's my most treasured possession now, this piece of gum is. At nights, I just stick it in the end of my bedpost. And it's as good as ever in the mornings. It's a bit hard at first, maybe, but it soon softens up again after I've given it a few good chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day, and I used to do it in our elevator on the way home from school. Why the elevator? Because I liked sticking the gooey piece I had just finished onto one of the elevator buttons. Then the next person who came along and pressed that button got my old gum at the end of their finger. Huh? And what a racket they kicked up, some of them. You get the best results with women who have expensive gloves on. Oh yes, I'm thrilled I'll be going to Mr. Wonka's factory, and I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me the rest of my whole life. Whoopee! Hooray! Beastly girl, cried Grandma Josephine. Despicable, said Grandma Georgina. She'll come to the sticky end one day chewing all that gum. You see if she doesn't. And who got the fourth golden ticket, Daddy? Charlie asked. Now let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The fourth golden ticket, he read, was found by a boy called Mike TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed like all the others, with excited visitors when our reporter arrived. But young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. Can't you fools see I'm watching television, he said angrily. I wish you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set, with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which a bunch of gangsters were shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from the belts around his body, and every now and again he would leap up into the air and fire off half a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. Quiet, he shouted when someone asked him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the crummy ones, where there's no shooting. I like the gangsters best. They're terrific, those gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead, or flashing the old stilettos, or giving each other 1, 2, 3 with their knuckled dusters. Oh boy, what I wouldn't give to be doing that myself. It is the life, I tell you. It's terrific. That's quite enough, snapped Grandma Josephine. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. Do all children behave like this nowadays? Like these brats we've been hearing about? Of course not, said Mr. Bucket, smiling at the old lady in the bed. Some do, of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do. But not all, no. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, sniffled Grandma Georgina. and just quite as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. Welcome to Chapter 9, my dear children, which is titled Grandpa Joe Takes a Gamble. Yeah. The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went in to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa George as he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one of his hands. And when the hand came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in the fingers. Under the cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver 10-cent piece. "It's my secret hoard," he whispered. "The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding the last ticket. How about that? But you'll have to help me." "Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa?" Charlie whispered. "Of course I'm sure," sputtered the old man excitedly. "Don't stand there arguing. I'm just as crazy as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down to the nearest store and buy the first Wonka candy bar you see and bring it straight back to me, and we'll open it together." Charlie took the little silver coin and slipped it quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes he was back. "Have you got it?" whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the candy bar. "Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise," it said on the wrapper. "Oh, one of my candy bars with nuts. I do like nuts, my dear children, yeah." "Good," the old man whispered, sitting up in the bed and rubbing his hands. "Now come over here and sit close to me, and we'll open it together. Are you ready?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I'm ready." "All right, you tear off the first bit." "No," Charlie said, "you paid for it, you do it all." The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the candy bar. "We don't have a hope, really," he whispered, giggling a bit. "You do know we don't have a hope, don't you?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I know that." They looked at each other, and they both started giggling nervously. "Mind you," said Grandpa Joe, "there is just that tiny chance that it might be the one. Don't you agree?" "Yes," Charlie said, "of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa?" "All in good time, my boy, all in good time. Which end do you think I ought to open first?" "That corner. That furthest one from you. Just tear off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything." "Like that?" said the old man. "Yes, now a bit more." "You finish it," said Grandpa Joe. "I'm too nervous." "I'm going to finish it for you, my dear children. Hurry it up." "No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself." "Very well then, here it goes." He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of candy, nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into pearls of laughter. "What the heck's going on?" cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. "Nothing," said Grandpa Joe. "You go on back to sleep now." We're going to be reading one more chapter in this episode, my dear children. It's chapter 10, titled The Family Begins to Starve. Oh my goodness, that doesn't sound very good, no. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw huge flakes drifting slowly down out of an icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Oh my goodness. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing through it, through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted, and because the family couldn't afford it, and as the cold weather went on, he became desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. But then all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets, but it wasn't enough to even buy a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day, as he came near it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on the end, taking deep swallowing breaths, as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. That child, said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with, but he's a growing boy. He can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton. But what can one do, muttered Grandma Josephine miserably. He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, and he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back. He's a fine little fellow, said Grandpa George. He deserves better than this. The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over his cheeks that you could see the shape of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful that he could go on for much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so as to save his strength. In the mornings, he left his house 10 minutes earlier, so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He quietly sat in the classroom during recess, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly, to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he ever had felt before, his eye suddenly caught a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter, in the snow. The paper was of greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a dollar bill. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him, on the sidewalk, their chins sunk deep into the collars of their coats, their feet crunching the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then it was his, this dollar. Could he have it? Carefully Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole dollar! He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him, at that moment. Only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving toward the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quickly to himself, is he would buy one luscious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there. And then the rest of his money he would take straight back home and give to his mother. Yeah, alright my dear children, that was today's reading for episode 2 of Willy Wonka, Reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Very soon I'll be releasing episode 3, and we'll start at chapter 11, titled The Miracle. And we're almost where we enter my factory, my dear children, so I hope you're excited. Yeah, make sure you check the description of this YouTube video to find the links to all of my social accounts and my merch. Yeah, thank you very much, my dear children. I'll see you very soon. Huh? Yeah.